Welcome to our episode 4 of the Lay of the Land podcast from the Scottish Land Commission. I am your host, Calum Maclean. This episode I'm speaking to Col Gordon. Col is a seed researcher, baker and farmer's son, now living in the Scottish Highlands close to his family farm, Inchindown. Col has his own podcast, Landed, which is a personal exploration of land ownership and colonial legacy. Welcome please, Col Gordon. Well, Col, you grew up on a family farm at Inchindown and you spent years away, you've returned now. Was it always something you wanted to do, to work on that farm, to continue what's your father's work, really?
Yeah, I think growing up, I didn't really think I was going to be a farmer. And it was really not until I left and went to uni that I kind of started thinking about farming in terms of we had this farm, and there was all sorts of things I was becoming exposed to, that farming and land just seemed like they were really important pieces to a bigger puzzle. And I started getting really excited about it in my early 20s. And at that point sort of decided I was wanting to spend my life working that piece of land and trying to promote and practice a lot of these ideas around of sustainable farming methods and how to get good local food to people, all these kind of things that I was becoming aware of. I moved down south to the south of England in order to sort of skill up, as it were, and life got in the way of the plan and ended up spending about 10 years there because my wife, her friends, family and her work were all needing to be there. So it has absolutely always been, in my adult life really, the goal to continue that. And it's not just my father's work, it's my grandfather's, and it goes beyond that. We've been farmers for a great number of generations. I've sort of felt that I didn't want to be the one who, that generation that broke that.
But would it have to specifically be the farm you grew up on and you felt a connection to? You couldn't, for example, take over a farm in England. Would that be the same thing for you?
Being away from the farm for as long as I did, we were like, oh, well, maybe the farm is just not going to be able to happen. Maybe we're just not going to be able to do that. And yeah, I really wanted to farm. There's lots of other reasons why I really feel strongly about being in the Highlands where we are. But in terms of being on the land, we were kind of like, oh, well, if this isn't going to happen, maybe we try to make it work down there. And it was really down there that I became increasingly aware of just how difficult it is if you aren't going to just be farming on this bit of land that you happen to sort of be able to just walk into in some way. If you're from a family farm or you have family members who farm, if you don't have that in the specific place where you are trying to live, it's really difficult to gain access to and tenure of land. And we tried it a little bit down there in various capacities, and it's not easy at all. And I definitely found that through trying. Despite knowing that there was this option of up in the Highlands, a decent sized farm, there was always this tension of, oh, can we try to make it work down here, down south? And that really opened my eyes to just how difficult it is for people who aren't born with the privileges that I have.
And seeing as though you grew up on a farm and the farm's been in your family, if someone were to come in, someone else were to take over running it at some point in time, would that feel odd to you, unusual?
In terms of the running of the family farm, yeah, I think it definitely would. That question is a good question, but in terms of what the likelihood would be, if that type of thing was to happen, the scenario that would play out would be that myself and my brothers, for whatever reason, were not able to take on the running of the farm, and it had to go on the market or something like that. And what almost certainly would happen is it would be bought up by a bigger farm or just a big investment firm or something like that, and the land would be bought up as an asset. And I feel in that situation that I think would be very difficult for me. Yeah, certainly I feel that I have a connection with this specific place. It's not me who owns the farm. My father and my parents, they're the owners, but I definitely feel a real relationship with the farm, and to see that just become an asset that is just treated with no real care or love necessarily by people who are making the decisions about what happens to it. I think I would find that very difficult. If it was the case that someone who wanted to farm it and live their life and commit to that place and really feel that and they were the people who were taking over, that I would have much less of a problem with that than the scenario I maybe just described earlier.
Even on your own family's farm, I understand that you're trying to bring in new ideas, new things, for example, a bakery. That's not something that had been done before, am I right?
Yeah, so I mean, in my time down south, I'd spent a lot of time just working in alternative grains and the economies that are around those sort of things. So we've grown 11 acres of grain this year, which, that is nothing for a massive grain farm. But I'm hoping that that's going to be able to produce, 10,000 loaves of bread. That's a lot of bread. That is certainly viable as a part of an income. The bakery is a new idea. I'm trying to get it finished, and also just working out. There's infrastructure there in terms of getting local food to all sorts of folks that's missing. So we don't have mills, for instance. There's the Gosby mill. We're very lucky to have that in the area, but it's the last fully commercial, just purely commercial water mill in Scotland. There's only a handful of mills. So in order to make these kind of local food economies sort of stack up and work, we do need to work out where this bottleneck is. And I think, again, that community scale rather than just the individual farm scale. I'm working at the moment to see if it might be possible to create a mill that is able to service the sort of region rather than just my farm, my 11 acres. And again, that's this community scale I think is really important for looking at where these bottlenecks are.
How does it feel to make bread, maybe with your own hands, using grain that's been grown on land right around you? It's
such an obvious, simple idea. I mean, I think it's quite, there's a lot of symbolic ideas in there in terms of just that. But this type of approach to grain and bread it's starting to become a little bit more normal again. But there's some really, really great farmers I know who only grow amazing crops of wheat. And it just never occurred to them that they could go to their grain bin and grind a little bit of flour and make a bit of bread from it. It can be quite empowering, and I think it also can be quite transformative if we just see these massive fields of grain potentially as bread. 0%, literally 0% of the wheat grown in Scotland is used for bread. I would like to see that change a little bit.
I know, I don't have a farm myself, but the potatoes I've grown in my garden, probably the best tasting potatoes I've ever had.
And I'm sure your neighbour would say the same about theirs.
But do you feel that connection when you've grown something and then you've turned it into something that you can eat yourself, but then you can also potentially, serve your community through it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's quite special. You can feel a type of pride that you don't really have in a lot of other ways. A kind of good kind of pride. It can be seen as good work as well. I think it's and that potentially is quite hard to find now. Just work that has a bit of meaning, and it can taste really good. I should say the bakery is not going yet, so there's not that many loaves that I've done of that. But hopefully in a month or two, I'll be starting to roll out some loaves to local folks.
Great. What's your own specialty bread then?
I mean, I pretty much work exclusively with sourdough in terms of my baking. So it's sourdough made of heritage grains, I suppose. Nothing particularly fancy. It's just, other than the ingredients, really.
You mentioned in your own podcast and in articles that you've written as well, a statement that you read, and it's a short one: the family farm is a colonial concept. Now, that kind of statement then, well, initially, when you first thought about it, how did it make you feel?
Yeah, I say in the podcast, when I read it, it was like a punch in the gut. It was just ooh, that's really, there's something there, but that really makes me feel uncomfortable. And I was kind of curious as to why I felt as uncomfortable about that rather than just brushing it off. So yeah, I mean, I spent a long time thinking about just that statement and what that would mean to where we are, where the family farm is. How did it come to be that the family farm structure is so dominant? It's so kind of all-pervasive and unquestioned, because it really is the dominant, even within it. I mean, the world I like to sort of place myself in is kind of the one of sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, agroecology, organics, these kind of types of things. But all of them tend to operate within a sort of family farm structure and see that as the model through which these things are going to be implemented. To sort of think, ooh, maybe we don't necessarily, maybe this isn't the right thing, or maybe it's just that fundamental question of the family farm is how did that come to be? First of all, that the family farm itself as a structure is really threatened at the moment. It doesn't seem to be robust in a way that is able to we can't just assume that will continue. The average age of a farmer in Scotland at the moment is, as far as I understand it, still 59. So that's a very top-heavy workforce who also tend to have the control over that land. And, who's to say that it's going to be people who want to farm it who are the people who the land is passed on to? I mean, it tends to be a third is the number that, as I understand it, that things are disappearing at. So since I think that 1990 and 2016, I understand that a third of small family farms in Britain, or just family farms in Britain, disappeared. So I understand that's the sort of number that the trend is happening. So big question of succession, whether these farms are going to survive or whether there's going to just be fewer and fewer people owning it. But then in terms of the colonial side of it, how did that come about? We learn about in school that there used to be a system up here, the clan system. People know about the clan system, but for some reason it hadn't clicked in my head that, and we know about the clan territories and like that's something that's just kind of, reasonably common knowledge, but it hadn't clicked that a family farm structure doesn't necessarily sit comfortably in that. So there was a very different way of relating to the land in this part of the world, the Highlands and Islands, up until the fall of the clan system. And I sort of was exposed to a number of ideas and statements just saying that you could easily read what happened there through the lens of colonialism in terms of why it disappeared. The flip side of that, so that's a very local, zooming in locally here, but you can expand that out globally and just see how interconnected to global patterns of colonialism and empire the formation of family farms in this part of the world was. So a lot of the money that was used to make these initial investments in the landscape, putting in the infrastructure, drainage, walls, hedges, all these sort of things, the vast majority of that money wasn't coming from the farms themselves. It was coming from extractive empire, colonial projects, enslavement around the world. So there's this kind of dual thing where you've got a very local expression of pretty colonial, and then a more kind of like global thing, and they're utterly connected and interlinked. And I think that that's something that is kind of just hidden below the surface, but it's actually like it's only just below the surface if you just start to connect a few dots. And the family farm structure in this part of the world, as far as I understand it, was enabled to come about through colonialism. Is it a way, I guess, looking at land ownership, how does that relate to today's land ownership and potential land reform? Is there a connection there? Yeah, I think it's really important that when we're thinking about what happens next with land reform, that this isn't like a sub-branch. The racial justice part of this isn't a sub-branch of it that's sort of tacked on at the side. And given what we know about patterns of ownership, of land ownership, and how things have changed so drastically over the last sort of 300-400 years, it needs to be absolutely, in my opinion, it needs to be absolutely at the heart of everything that we do. Just like racial justice needs to be embedded into all of these conversations and really taken seriously, because it's so interlinked in terms of how we've got to the point we are today. It's not just about what happened to, in the case of the Highlands, the Gaels. If we're trying to imagine something that is sort of refinding ourselves, I suppose, as reimagining what the Highlands are, we need to align ourselves in the Highlands with post-colonial movements, and there should be this allyship, and racial justice needs to be absolutely at the heart of all of this. Do you know how that would be achieved? There's an organisation which I would encourage people to look at, Land in Our Names, which is a Black-led land justice movement, an organisation. And I think that there needs to be on the ground collaboration in places where, like, if people start thinking about this, how to bring community ownership into a parcel of land. I think through organisations such as Lion and other groups, there just needs to be more of a conversation. We need to just work out how to bring a more diverse voice into those conversations, a sustained voice in that conversation as well, so it's not just brought in as a sort of like to tick a box.
You use a phrase as part of the podcast that you dig where you stand, so you start to look literally at the landscape around where you are and the farm that you're on and the Highlands almost. Why do you think it's important that people should take an interest in the land around them, no matter where you are, I guess, in the country?
I think it's very empowering to take that approach because, well, first of all, I mean, I think I quite deliberately, potentially provocatively, I talk about what might have been in the Highlands and Islands, the word Indigenous. Which is potentially a little bit controversial, but talking about Indigenous ways of seeing the world, Indigenous land management practices, these are not the ideas that we're used to thinking about necessarily in terms of where we are as Europeans, as places in Europe, in Scotland. And that type of practice we tend to associate with, for instance, First Nations people in the Americas, Australia, the sort of new world, as it were. And I think that there's so many stories. If you sort of ground whatever you're investigating with these type of things, literally where you are, and then be able to zoom out a little bit from there, you can see how it all connects. And also just that your place, wherever you are, wherever you're from, wherever you've ended up, wherever you happen to be, that place has lots of really important deep stuff that is potentially useful for understanding how to navigate your history and also potentially your present and your future in terms of the land. The Highlands and Islands, potentially they can be seen as quite an exceptional case. There's a language there that's very distinct. It's a very distinctive landscape. There's quite a distinct culture. A lot of people might just say, oh, well, it's fine there. But I think every place is just a place. It's just a place, and everywhere is just a place, and it will have its own place-based relationships and cultures, and they are interlinked with all sorts of other places. So starting where you stand, I think, is very empowering. So digging where you stand.
What do you think about the demographic of landowners in Scotland? What kind of effect does that have on farming, the future of land ownership and the future of farming? I mean, we can see it changing, I guess, in lots of places currently right now.
The demographic at the moment is, as I said before, it's quite top heavy in terms of age. So we're seeing an average age of 59 of farmers. It's because the size of farms has up until this point, it tended to have become bigger rather than smaller. This sort of means that the parcels are very, very big. If the land prices of each acre is quite high, then that means that the lots that are going for sale at any point are hundreds, if not thousands of hectares or acres. And obviously there's only a certain amount of people who are able to even begin to bid on that type of thing. So just all of those factors in and of them. I should also say, just with that aging population, in my opinion, there's likely to be a lot of land that comes onto the market from now on over the next 15 years or so. So there's likely to be just a lot of land coming on very, very quickly, and only a very, very, very small amount of people or organisations who are able to bid on that.
So thinking about that, with lots of land potentially coming on the market, and we know the average age of the farmers fairly, 59 is what you said. How can we get more young people involved in the land then?
It's a really tricky question because it's not. I mean, in terms of the obvious routes to go, there are some. I mean, I think the Land Commission have been really good about exploring a lot of these ideas, particularly for farmers. Like there's the land matching service, there's partnerships, all these kind of options, but. The fundamental question of ownership, I think we're going to see that concentration unless there are other mechanisms. I think that there's some interesting ones that have just been long established. Crofting. Crofting is a really, really, in my opinion, it's a really, really great model. It's got a proven track record of its core principles working quite well. And then there's the community buyout legislation that we have to play with, as it were. My understanding is that has never explicitly been used in Scotland for agricultural land. And I think I get really excited about the potential for community buyouts to happen using this legislative framework in Scotland to maybe open up routes to access for new entrants through community ownership. And if we're going for the Good Food Nation bill, which is currently back on the cards within the Parliament, if that is what we're trying to go for, I really think that in order to achieve that, we do need more people on the land. So from a policy point of view, I suppose, it makes sense that we think about, as all this land starts to come onto the market, that how do we enable those type of community buyouts to take place on some of this land as it comes into the market in order to grow this food that we're hoping to have through the Good Food Nation.
Another thing we are seeing as well is effectively what are being called green layers, companies buying land to offset their CO2. And this can obviously look good potentially to the people that are investing in that company, but it might have a different impact maybe on the ground and to the communities. What do you think of that? How does that impact the potential for communities to get involved in their land?
I think it's a really pertinent point that's really we need to talk about quite quickly and loudly, because the people who are these green lairds have the power to just go in there. And at the moment, there is a very critical climate crisis with carbon really on the agenda in terms of what we're trying to achieve. We're wanting to create landscapes that suck carbon out of the atmosphere, sorry. There's an opportunity here. Carbon markets are starting to open up to sort of pay for that to happen. And it looks really good. It's really, like, from a PR point of view, for, a big landowner to just take over a massive area of land and put it all to carbon or rewilding. I really get scared about normal people totally get locked out of it when this happens. I mean, I think all these things are really important, rewilding, carbon capture. But in terms of decision making, in terms of ability to have some sort of say or stake in the land, I think we need to be really careful about how those type of transitions to a carbon capture landscape, a rewilded landscape happen, so that they involve people, so that we don't see an expansion of yet another Highland clearances where people or just clearances of the land where just fewer and fewer and fewer folk have any sort of stake or say. And because of the timeframes that we're talking about within carbon capture, you're talking about 100-year contracts and stuff like that. If folks are shut out, just like the deer fences, that's a couple generations that have just completely lose connection to the land. And I think it's really urgent that we challenge that idea of just like concentration of ownership enabled by those things.
But with climate change being such a big topic and really on everyone's mind, particularly right now, are there ways that land use, land ownership can be used to tackle climate change, but also used by a community, used by a commons of people almost? For example, a farm. If a farm it has lots of people working on it and it has a community around it and people, working on it, having good jobs, can that farm, as an example of land, can that be used to help tackle climate change and, for example, not rewilded and sold as carbon credits to someone?
Yeah, I think and again, rewilding, I don't think is in and of itself, the actual practices of rewilding, with the technical side of stuff. I think that can absolutely involve humans, and it needs to involve humans. And I think rewilding itself needs to be humans need to themselves start to slightly rewild. We know that there's practices such as agroecology, which really look at ecology and locally biomes as your model that you're trying to mimic in a productive landscape. The danger of these carbon landscapes is that we just see agriculture over here, and over here in a different place there is sort of wilderness. And the agriculture that's over here is very, very intensive and mechanized, and again doesn't have many people in it, just like the carbon capture landscape over here doesn't have any people in it, and is just is blocked off either in sort of monoculture plantation, less so nowadays that you have that, but same sort of thing, just one use. Whereas like there are all sorts of like proven methods of agricultural practice that need to be encouraged, where agroforestry, for instance, where you're integrating forestry, you're integrating with livestock, with crops, with, you know, fruits and veg. I don't know, for me that's a more integrated mosaic seems much more appealing in terms of an outcome, and potentially might be able to achieve a lot of the same goals whilst having all these additional goals that it potentially can achieve, and maybe stem some big future problems.
I guess having that outlook that you've got, a lot of that would have come from the research that you did through making your podcast, you know, looking at how the land was used, for example, in the Highlands before the current model is in place. Yeah,
I think so. I mean, it was definitely a commons-based model, as far as I understand it. You were using the whole landscape in ways that were, it's been reasonably well documented by people like Frank Fraser-Darling, just like what the landscape looked like prior to the clearances, and the loss of that landscape as a result of the hills being filled with sheep. There was the landscape, the sort of agricultural calendar of the people in this part of the world was based on the shealing system, where people would, every summer, they would take animals up into the hills, they would reasonably extensively graze them, and then they would come back down. As I say, it was reasonably well documented that improved the biome and the soils and the fertility and blah, blah, blah. I think whilst I don't think we shouldn't look at those practices as like what we should return to necessarily, in terms of like, there isn't a blueprint from the past that is our future. I think it can inform maybe what we try to do going forward in terms of what was done in the past, what worked, what didn't work, why did it work, and how can we make it appropriate for today.
I mean, I don't know. I think spending a summer up in the hills, kind of walking up with the cattle, barefoot across the heather, I think it'd be quite an appealing way to spend a summer. I don't know.
Well, I'd imagine you wouldn't be alone in that thought, certainly. Like, I don't know, maybe the midges would get the better of you after a night or two, like that.
That's true. So we've been talking, I guess, about rural land ownership a lot. Do you think it is a topic that's just as relevant in urban spaces? That is where the most people in Scotland live. The majority do live in urban places. I
definitely see myself as a rural person. So I can't necessarily speak for urban, but like, I think certainly a lot of the similar sort of pressures around ownership of housing and things like that are similar in terms of folks just unable to gain access to some of these things. There is housing crisis. Again, my focus tends to be on like space for food and food growing. And it's just like, I think, there is lots of space that folks are able to learn more about and engage more about these practices and ways of going about growing and producing food that are relevant to urban spaces. I would like to encourage more of a two-way stream of we tend to think about people commuting into cities to work, whereas people live in the cities. That's where the majority is, as you say. But I would love to see the peri-urban and people commuting a little bit out. And obviously there's issues in terms of inequalities and who's able to access that type of infrastructure to get in and out of cities like that. But yeah, to see that sort of two-way flow rather than just people commuting into the city, for people from the city coming out a bit to engage in the landscape a little bit in terms of production and food, and also just being in the more than human world is a really important factor. And I think, again, these kind of, the green layered type topics, it's like, what I don't really want to see is this kind of human world separated from the more than human world. So I think that sort of two-way flow is a really interesting way to start to imagine how to bring people who are in urban spaces more into that more than human space.
I guess a lot of people who potentially live in like urban places, live in a city, the reason they'll go to the countryside or they'll go to, a national park, for example, is to almost to get away from that life, get away from the usual life for a while. But could there be a way where people where you're changing that way of thinking to, involving people being in these places more often and changing the way they think about them as being empty places and getting involved in these places more?
I think, again, I'm going to come back to this idea of like the community ownership of land. And one of the things that I certainly have picked up in my research is just there's this tension, and it's got very good reasons within land policy of communities of interest versus communities of place. So rural spaces, in order to have access to that legislation, you need to essentially live in those spaces already to engage in maybe a buyout of a farm, say, in a rural space. But like, I don't, even if that legislation still stands, what I would really love to imagine how to think about is how communities of place can connect with communities of interest in urban spaces. And this two-way flow thing to start to happen. So people do feel like they have a stake in these rural spaces in terms of like a place where they can go and volunteer, and maybe, just a space where they can go to be. I think something that I would love to see a little bit more of is routes that are encouraged for this communities of place in rural areas connecting with communities of interest in urban areas, and see if there can be more of a dialogue about how people would like to see those spaces. And I think that's going to be a really interesting and positive, in my opinion, two-way flow of ideas and flow of concerns. And it's just going to be that type of thing is, in my opinion, something that we really need to see a lot more of, rather than just having like urban people and rural people and there's just a binary there. Like, people always move. Like, I go back to the city now and again. Like, it's I don't know. Yeah. We're all moving all the time. So I'd love to see that more.
And how would you see that happening? Could it be, I'm thinking more like, practically, would it be going and volunteering somewhere? For someone that lives in a city and they feel like they want to get more involved, potentially in a place that they visit, but aren't involved. Maybe they go and they feel like an outsider there. How would they actively get involved, do you think? Like, could someone phone up your farm and say, I'd like to come and, I don't know, do some berry picking or...
Yeah, I bet also more than that. Like, I think, as I say, that a lot of these places are trying to work out what next, like, in terms of, like, what happens to land when these 59-year-old plus farmers start to retire. And, like, they're not, within families, they're not conversations that are easy to have. Just to start having dialogue about these sort of things and these really difficult and challenging and uncomfortable topics of, like, what's going to happen when nobody in your family is going to wants to take over the land, right? And, like, how can we organize? How can we mobilize to think about a different thing? And that can be, like, I don't think, again, this sort of, like, binary thing of the farmer over there and the community over here, like, it's there's going to be a lot of commonalities in terms of what both parties are potentially hoping to get out of something like this. Yeah, there's going to be all sorts of ways to go about doing that sort of conversation piece, but they're not easy necessarily. They're not. It's not normal that yet, but we need to sort of work out ways to make it more easy and normal.
Would a community-owned farm work?
There's examples that do. We've seen that. You don't necessarily need to be there's a very successful one in Shropshire in England, Fordall Farm, I think it's called. It's been going for a number of years and there's like 7,000 owners. And it's I think they've only got a couple tenant farmers on it, but they have to report to their stakeholders. There are community farms, the Kindling Trust and near Manchester, I think they've recently taken over one. I really don't see why it wouldn't work, but also, like, you look at crofting townships maybe as a model of how to make something like this work, and they work. So what I would love to see is just, even if it's not actually official crofting legislation, looking at the crofting township model as as a way to maybe implement this stuff. So you have individual parcels of small crofts, common grazing type scenario where there's this more extensive thing beyond, and like that works. We know that works. So applying that to the fertile lowlands, I don't see why, as a model, even if it's not officially crofting, like regulated by the Crofting Commission, I don't see why that couldn't work there as well.
As long as the people are prepared to do the hard graft, crofting like that, I guess, is not an easy way of life for anyone that tries to take it on.
No, but I mean, at the same time, I know I could rattle off a name of 5 or 6 people just without thinking about it who are desperate to get hold of, 5 or 6 acres to start growing vegetables or whatever. There are people out there, and fair enough. And it's just how do we find them and organise and sort of get these people to be really on the conversation is not. I don't have any answers in terms of how to sort of think about organising that, but there are definitely people who want to do that kind of work. A lot of work is really, regardless of what I've worked all sorts of different types of thing, and they're all hard graft as well. Like, it's like a lot of people, it's see farming as really, really tricky, but and hard work, but a lot of work's hard.
True that. And maybe as you get more people from urban places to, these interest groups to come to more rural places where the population's smaller, the more people that experience that, you're potentially going to find more of these people who want to take on that way of life, want to have that say in the land, but maybe don't even realise it yet because of where they are, because they don't have that connection to the land, because they don't see it and feel it very often at all.
I also feel that, frankly, I think a lot of people now just don't even imagine it as a possibility because there's no way in. So, there's really not very many people who have entered this from the outside and have got a complete sort of autonomy in terms of what they're doing, or I don't know. I think there's a lot of people who couldn't even imagine how they could begin a career in farming. So it's not even a possibility. So showing people that there might well be a possibility of how that could happen, I think people, I would hope that you'd start to see a lot more people who would start to imagine that this is something that they might want to do with their life. It's so hard to get into. It's so exclusive in terms of who's able to farm that most people can't even imagine it as a possibility.
We've talked a wee bit about climate change and potential role that farming could have in helping to combat that, because I guess a lot of our land usage is farming. COP26, what kind of legacy do you think that could leave for climate change in Scotland connected with the land? I mean, would you have any hopes for what it could achieve? What would you want to come from something like that, I guess?
In terms of farming, I really would like to see a focus on enabling practices of agroecology and regenerative agriculture, and to enable new entrants to get onto the farms, onto the land. I think regenerative agriculture is a term that gets bandied around quite a bit. I actually don't really like that term anymore because I think it doesn't deal with the people side as much. You can change your sort of tillage practices or whatever it is, and that's regenerative agriculture. Agroecology tends to focus more on having people involved in it as well, and I really believe that we can achieve a lot of these carbon and climate change solutions through land, but it's going to require a lot more people on it to do the type of practice that I would like to see. We need to have more people on the land, in my opinion, to enable a truly agroecological type of food system, which is delivering on multiple goals. It's not just carbon. I think it is possible, integrating trees integrating more diverse crops, integrating more diverse techniques of management for livestock. These type of things, they can be achieved, but they're going to require more people. They're proven that they can produce more food. Like we know that per acre you can produce a lot more food than we do, but it's just not per man hour, as it were. We're pretty maxed out there, but that man hour metric has been the dominant one, and it's just more and more people have got out of this agricultural space as the worker has become more productive. I don't think that's the land becoming more productive. It's just, yeah.
What would be the main thing that needs to happen to see an increase in that type of farming? Would it be the changing of the land ownership models, making barriers to people coming in much easier?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's ownership so much as tenure. Like, ownership is important, but I think people having tenure of lands and secure tenure of land is the critical thing. Ownership is important, but it's that tenure thing. So people feeling that they have secure access to land and long-term access to land in order to make these. I mean, with the carbon stuff, we're talking about, if we plant a tree, we're not going to see much carbon from it for like 30, 40 years. So like, for people to make that investment, they need to know that they have long-term, they're going to be there. And I feel we need to have on-the-ground buy-in as well as just sort of top-down buy-in on these really important topics. Giving people security of tenure and ways to see themselves, because a lot of tenure models are maybe, you're going to be there in 10 years, but with housing price, with land prices just increasingly just going up, doesn't necessarily mean that you can put in 10 years worth of investment and then asked to move on.
I guess when it comes to, if it's like a farm, or if it's land, and if it's got a community interest, or a community has a say in that, they care. Do they care more about how that land is used? Do they care more about doing the right thing with it? Whether that's, dealing with climate change, or, seeing more biodiversity. Do they care more than, for example, a corporation that, the people aren't there and they're not dealing with the land in day out?
I think communities are complex. People have different priorities. People have different opinions as to what's best use. It's always contested. Because it's complex, decision-making becomes quite messy, always does. So I don't think it's that clear that as a community, at a community level, you'd necessarily just be able to say that you care more. You probably do care more about your place than someone who's not there, but in terms of the targets and what you're prioritizing, that is not a given that it's going to be about biodiversity or the climate crisis. I think definitely one of the potential advantages of given how there is this very urgent climate crisis, and we need to respond to that conglomerates and big people who have lots of resources probably are able to, if they decide to implement changes quickly. But as I say, those changes, whilst they need to be implemented, they might not necessarily be the best ones for communities.
So I guess the challenge could be for people to pressure them into making the right decisions, possibly, to try and convince them that whilst people might not have control of the land, that whoever does have control of the land, try and somehow influence them into making the right decisions. Although I guess it comes down to who decides what the right decision is. And yeah, it's also, everyone's going to have different opinions as to what the right decision is and what best use is, because if the public think that rewilding is the right thing and carbon, then the communities on the ground who are forced out of those places or don't really have a say in those places, they're not going to agree with that. It's tricky. I mean, I think the scale of the crises, the multiple crises that we're facing, mean that the simple solutions aren't necessarily possible that have all the multiple outcomes that we're trying to look for. So there's urgency to make something happen. But the simple, quick fix solutions might not be the best ones. What do you see personally as the future, or what comes next for your own farm, for Inchindown? What comes next for that, do you think? A lot of conversations with my family. We need to as I say, I in no way feel that I have ownership of the farm. I don't actually particularly want that. I have two brothers that really, really need to be in
deeply into this conversation as to what happens next. My father, he's not getting any younger, and he's starting to step back a little bit, or at least allow me to have a bit of space on the farm to make some moves. And he's been really, really supportive in terms of some of the things that I've been doing. So we're trying to change a few things. We've switched over to native breeds of livestock, of cattle, that we used to be big continental breeds. I'm starting to grow different types of heritage varieties of grains on the farm for the first time we've done that. There's lots of changes happening, but I think one of the things that I think is really important is that it's really important and urgent to have these conversations and really start to have these really difficult conversations. But in terms of just thinking we need to have solutions implemented, I think there's a big danger in just trying to just get stuff to happen without properly spending the time doing it right and working out how to do this sort of quite big transformations that I would like to see. But if we just rush into those, they're probably not going to work longer term. So it's important, and I think it's vital to just spend the time that's needed to make these things happen. It's quite characteristic of imperial and colonial projects to expect something to happen now, and this stuff can't just happen now. We need to be talking about it now. But we need to just be working out how to make it happen.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Col. I would encourage everyone to, listen to your podcast if they get the chance. I learned a lot myself, looking at the history of the Highlands, some of which I kind of knew anyway, but I think a lot of it that people won't know, even though you say it's just so close. And then bringing that back to kind of your own farm, I thought it was a really interesting way of doing it. And I really enjoyed it.
And thank you very much. Yeah, it's been good chatting to you.
So that's it for episode 4 of the Lay of the Land podcast. Thank you so much to Col for sharing his story. Make sure you listen to Col's own podcast, Landed, by Farmerama Radio. And if you'd like more information about how you might get involved in the way land is owned and used in your area, and how land plays a key role in tackling climate change, visit myland.scot for stories, news and case studies for what's happening with the land around you. Join us for the next episode soon.